All right, so today we jump into yet another specific reform movement as we continue to discuss this era of reform. And that reform movement is the women's rights movement. The history of the women's rights movement is probably quite a bit longer and dates farther back than some people would even think. And it is something that has never gone away since it's begun. And so the connection between this specific reform movement and all the others that we've been talking about is that all of the other reform movements, public education, we had women like Dorothea Dix reforming our prison system and the way we treat mentally ill people, all of these, the abolition movement, all these other reform movements really end up becoming a catalyst for the women's rights movement, because women started to become very heavily involved in these other reform movements. Now, that was very controversial. Women were not supposed to be getting involved in things like this. This was the idea of doing anything publicly, like speaking out on an issue or going to a meeting or anything like that. That was supposed to be reserved for men in our culture. So their participation in these early reform movements was very controversial. It wasn't just something that was a cultural thing that women weren't supposed to be doing just because society said so. There were even legal ramifications. There were even laws that were passed that said women, it's illegal for women to do some of these certain things. So by the time we get to the 1840s and these other reform movements that started to take some hold in our culture and our society and make some ground, women decided that they were upset with the situation. And decided that they should have a place in these other reform movements. And so that's sort of the beginning of what will eventually turn into their own movement, the women's rights movement. One of the women, we're going to meet a handful of women here today that were influential, significant figures in this movement. And we're going to start with Catherine Beecher. You should recognize her name because we met her father, the evangelical preacher and reformer, Lyman Beecher. He was one of those evangelical preachers that was leading the way in that Second Great Awakening. Well, here's his daughter, Catherine Beecher, coming from a long line of reform-minded people in her family. But her role in the early women's rights movement is, it might be a little surprising to you, because when you think of women's rights and the movement to change things for women, the first thing that you're drawn to is women should be able to go out and do anything that a man can do, and they shouldn't be held back from those things, and women should be more than just housewives and mothers, and they should go do anything that they want to do. And while that is a big part of the movement, Catherine Beecher took it in a little different direction. She ends up being what we're going to say is the most influential advocate for the domestic roles of women, which might not seem to make sense at first, because why would she need to advocate for that? Because the domestic role, mother and housewife, mother and wife, were the roles that women were supposed to be satisfying. Well, Catherine Beecher looked at this, and she was able to do this because she came from an educated family. She was surrounded by reform-minded people. She was one of those rare women that actually was able to get access to education. She was a teacher, which is one of the jobs outside of the home that was acceptable for women to do in this era. But what she decided needed to happen was that this whole idea and this whole concept and the whole perception of women as mothers and wives has to change. What she advocated for was, yes, women should be mothers and wives first before they go off and do anything else, and that's okay. But the problem is, we aren't even giving them the respect they deserve for satisfying and fulfilling those two roles. In fact, it was Catherine Beecher's contention that the most important role that any woman in our culture can do is to be a mom and a housewife. In fact, she writes what becomes known as her treatise on domestic economy. A treatise is kind of like a mission statement. And so she put out there all of her ideas and what she felt. In this treatise on domestic economy, what she said was that, yes, women's ideal role in our society is to stay home, and is to be a mom, and it is to be a wife to their husband, and a mom to the family, and take care of the home. But we better darn well start respecting women for doing that, because in her estimation, it was the most important job that there was in our society. And if you think about that for a second, there's some logic to that. if we live in a society, certainly in the early 1800s, where men are going to be the ones to grow up and boys are going to grow up to be men and men are the ones that are going to be the leaders of our society, well, who makes those men into men? It's their moms first for raising the children, and then it's their wives for taking care of them as they are men and adults, right? And so she said, you know what? Things need to change. We need to start respecting women for that role. Now, of course, that's not the bulk of the women's rights movement. We know that, as I said earlier, the first thing that you think of when you think of women's rights is this idea of going outside of those roles of mom and wife and doing things beyond the home. And so clearly that is a direction that the movement moves in. And so I want to talk about that as well. Back to what I said about the early reform movements being having a significant impact on the actual women's rights movement taking hold. These movements like abolition, like public education, eventually we're going to talk about temperance on the next slide. These movements gave women opportunities to go out and do things that they had never done before, things out in the public, going and attending meetings, becoming parts of organizations and groups, speaking out publicly at public places, doing things politically and campaigning and lobbying and that kind of stuff. These were all things that women just didn't do, and now they were starting to do it in the name of education, in the name of abolition and getting rid of slavery. In fact, the abolition movement ends up being a very significant piece of women moving beyond the home in their own movement, because a lot of women saw the plight of African Americans, enslaved African Americans in the South, but even free blacks in the North, not being treated equally or not having the same opportunities. Women saw the connection between the two. Their issue wasn't, they weren't being treated that way and held back because of the color of their skin. They were being treated that way and held back because of their gender, because they were women. And so they had this obvious connection to the abolition movement, and they saw it as something that they were connected to in their own way too as women. So we start to see women starting to become active in the abolition movement. We see women attending meetings, joining the American Anti-Slavery Society, writing things to be published in anti-slavery newsletters like The Liberator and the North Star. We see women actually giving speeches in public places, and all of a sudden, this abolition movement starts to become a platform for their own movement, whether they even realized it or not at the beginning. Your book talks a little bit about the Grimke sisters. I just throw them in there because it was a connection. It kind of brings all these things together about women's rights and the abolition movement and slavery. The Grimke sisters are actually Southern women. And they saw the plight of slavery in the South and the plight of African Americans as something that needed to change. And they connected that because Southern women in particular, in our culture at the time, were much more oppressed even than Northern women in the North. A Southern woman on a plantation, the wife of a slave owner, really kind of served the role similar to being a slave. It was almost as if that wife on the plantation was just like another slave. And so these Southern women, the Grimke sisters, they started speaking out about both movements, about ending slavery and changing the way women should be treated in the South and really everywhere. So the abolition movement in particular really gives women this platform, and by platform what I mean is it ends up being something that these women can stand up on, like a platform, and be heard and hear their voices. Now, it might be at the beginning about slavery and abolition or about public education, or Dorothea Dix speaking out about the mentally ill in prisons, but the mere fact that women were doing that really meant that they were on this platform. And I found this image of a woman at a meeting, public place. She found a table literally to stand up on as the literal platform. So I'm talking figuratively, these other reform movements become the platform for these women to stand on and be heard, right? So one of the things I mentioned here that was equally probably significant as the abolition movement was the temperance movement. Now, we didn't give it its own piece in this unit as a specific reform movement because it is so much connected to the women's rights movement. So I'm going to give you a slide just on the temperance movement. Temperance was a movement to get people to stop drinking alcohol, or at least to be more temperate in their alcohol consumption. The term itself, to be temperate, means to do things in moderation. You don't overdo it, you do it with an amount of temperance. Well, in this case, the temperance movement meant it was connected to being temperate and being moderate about how much alcohol you consume. The bottom line was this: statistics show that in the early 1800s, in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s, alcohol consumption was at an all-time high in our society, in our country. And a lot of people looked at that and made connections between this high rate of alcohol consumption and alcoholism and connected it to a lot of the evil things that happen in our society. They connected it to crime. They made connections between alcohol consumption and domestic problems, divorce, child abuse, spousal abuse, and all these different negative kind of evils of our society. A lot of people look back at this idea of alcohol consumption and said, you know what, if we can get people to stop boozing so much and drinking so much alcohol, maybe some of these other evils of society will be affected positively. And so we start to see a temperance movement. The American Temperance Society is established in 1815, and guess who joined in great numbers? Women were drawn to this movement just like the abolition movement. And by 1834, this American Temperance Society was huge. There were thousands of local chapters all over the country, over 1 million members joined, and many of those members were women. So again, this was one of those platforms where women could be out there being heard publicly about some issue that they were concerned about. And in so doing, we start to see women really creating their own movement. All right, so between the abolition movement and the temperance movement, but really all those other reform movements, and the fact that women were doing things that they had never done before, it really created the atmosphere for an official women's rights movement to begin. Oh, I should say that the people that joined this temperance movement did have some success. They were out there kind of lobbying to people that made alcohol to stop making so much, to people that sold it, don't sell it so much, people that drank it, don't drink so much, abstain, slow down, whatever it takes. They even supported people in politics that would support laws to change the way we governed alcohol consumption. And guess what? In the 30 years after its existence, the American Temperance Society did have some success because we see statistics show that alcohol consumption dropped in our country. Now, does that mean that all crime stopped and that there was no more child abuse and no more divorces and no more marital problems? Well, there are correlations between those, but it's hard to say if what the direct connection was. But the bottom line was they did get people to stop drinking so much alcohol. All right, so now by the time all this starts happening, the mood is right for an official women's rights movement to occur, and that happens at the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention is the first convention meeting ever to specifically discuss women's rights issues. It wasn't a bunch of women at a convention to talk about the other issues. It was a bunch of women at the convention to talk specifically about women's rights. It happens in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Seneca Falls is actually not that far away from here. It's in New York. It's in northern New York. I've actually never been to Seneca Falls, but it's on my bucket list as something a place to visit so that I can see some of the history of the women's rights movement. The two women that we associate most with pioneering this movement to have this convention are women who you may have heard of before, I don't know, but you're going to hear of them now. Those two women were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. These are great American heroes that young girls in 2020 should be looking up to. These are women who were tough, who were strong, who were mean, who were willing to fight, and they organized this first ever women's rights convention. They come together at this convention, they meet, they listen to speakers, they talk about the issues, they have discussions, and in the end, the biggest impact of the accomplishment of the Seneca Falls Convention is a document that they publish afterwards. It's known as the Declaration of Sentiments, and in this document, they basically laid out all of the things that these women decided needed to change and all of the things that were issues that were on women's minds that they felt needed to be addressed in our society. And if you look at even the name of it, the Declaration of Sentiments, it should be very familiar to another very famous document, the Declaration of Independence, and even the wording of the Declaration of Sentiments was very specifically crafted in the same form as the Declaration of Independence, and it was very symbolic and it was done very much on purpose. Because women were saying, listen, we have this document that's supposed to be saying things like all people are treated equal, all men are created equal, and they didn't feel like that it was really doing what it was supposed to be doing in our country, in particular for women. 68 women ended up signing this, putting their names right on it and saying this is how we feel. And yes, there were men that attended this as well, 32 men. Only one African American attended the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. You want to take a guess who it was? You should probably be able to guess this because it was, in fact, my boy, Frederick Douglass. He was the only black person that attended this, and he, as far as I know, he signed the Declaration of Sentiments, I think. I know he was in attendance at the convention, and I throw that in there because, yet again, I want to illustrate that Frederick Douglass is my man. Yes, he was fighting for the rights that African Americans were fighting for and the end of slavery, but he wasn't about rights for blacks in this country. He was about rights for everyone in this country, including his sisters in the women's rights movement. And so he was going to say, yes, I'm right behind you, sisters. I'm going to support you as well. So shout out to my boy, Frederick Douglass. All right, and this Seneca Falls Convention ultimately is the beginning of what now becomes the organized official women's rights movement. And that movement has never ended. There are still issues today that we struggle with in our society in terms of the way women are treated versus the way men are treated, and it's an ongoing movement. So we have Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a lot of other brave, tough women that got the whole thing started to thank for the changes that have been made over time, and to thank for the fight that still continues to make equality something that all people get to enjoy. Let's see here. I think I'm going to end there. I double check the next slide, make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh, you know what? I'm glad I thought of that. Because I wanted to end with one other woman that was a strong woman that is going to make a connection between the last section, the section on slavery and abolition, and this section, section 3, about women's rights. And that woman is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is kind of the go-between between these two movements. She is a black woman who was very active in both of these movements. And it's reiterating the connection between these two things, that women and African Americans saw their plight as very similar. She was a slave who eventually gained her freedom and joined both of these movements. And she's an interesting figure because she was she was an important figure primarily for black women, but also she was an important reminder to the white women that were leading this movement, the Elizabeth Cady Stantons, the Lucretia Motts. Basically, what Sojourner Truth reminded white women of as this movement took hold is that there needs to be a place for their black sisters in this movement as well. But unfortunately, black women did not have the ability to dive to head first into the women's rights movement. It's because, as Sojourner Truth reminded the white women in the movement, they had a kind of a bigger fish to fry. They had something bigger on their plate, and that was the abolition of slavery first. But Sojourner Truth said, hey, white girls, there will be a time when we will end slavery, and we're going to fight for that. And when that happens, we want to come next to you and support you in your women's rights movement as well. So don't forget about us black women in the country. So I almost forgot about her, but she's a good one to end on.